I just want to thank you all for joining us on a conversation about this important topic. My name is, of course, Noah Patton, Senior Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And before we get to this excellent panel full of some of my favorite people that I get to work with, I just wanted to I'm contractually obligated, in fact, to reference some ongoing legislative pushes that NLIHC is involved in surrounding disaster recovery. Most notably, that is the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, which focuses on HUD's long-term disaster recovery funding called CDBGDR. And if you if you could say it 5 times fast, they let you be a legislative policy analyst for disaster recovery. And so the bill actually would permanently authorize that program. It's not permanently authorized, which means it moves pretty slow and has to kind of be rebuilt each time funds are appropriated by Congress. And through permanent authorization via the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, of course, we would add in some additional protections to ensure that recovery funding is reaching those most in need following disasters. So just for everybody's notes, just write down Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, call Senator about that. And there you go for that. So in addition, just some housekeeping. We will have a portion for Q&A at the end of the panel. We'll, of course, prominently mark that for everybody here. In addition, the emergency exits are here and there. In the event of a panel depressurization, the masks will fall from the top. Affix the mask to yourself before assisting children on doing that. So, it's like, please watch this seatbelt demonstration. No, so these panelists are just some of my favorite people that I get to work with at the National Low Income Housing Coalition on disaster recovery. So, I'll let them kind of wow you themselves with their own words. However, I just wanted to review and point out that we have Ariadna Michelle Gaudreau-Hebert, who's, of course, the founder and executive director of Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico. We have Chriselle Pillay, director of the Home Coalition out of Houston, who's also on the NLIHC board. Then we have Hannah Pearls, staff attorney, Harvard Law School Environmental and Energy Law Program, and David Wheaton, Economic Justice Policy Fellow at the NAACP LDF. I apologize about that, David. Should have added LDF at the end there. And again, of course, Noah Patton, Senior Policy Analyst for Disaster Recovery. And from there, I think we're good to kind of hop into it here. So it seems like the best place to start would be at the beginning of this topic. So we know that the answer to whether the right to return, the right to choose, and the right to adjust recovery, that answer to whether it is compatible with community survival amid climate change is heavily impacted by the degree of political, social, physical, and economic violence and inequity that communities face and have faced every day, even before a disaster occurs. So I'm going to ask our panelists to provide us with a description of what communities they work for and with, and in terms of this inequality and systemic violence, and what are the major influences and forces at work in that specific geographic area that might subsequently play a role in disaster recovery and housing recovery specifically. And then we'll come back to the lawyers here for some follow-up questions after that. So I can start with you, Ariadna.
Yeah, why not? Hi, hello everyone. I'm just extremely grateful to be here. As Noah said, my name is Ariadna and I'm from Puerto Rico. So when we start talking about the disaster context, of course we think about the last 6 years of major hurricanes, Hurricane Irma and Maria. We think about floods, Fiona, earthquakes, of course the impact of the pandemic. But when we're talking about the geographies that are being affected by disasters, it also has to do with the political disasters that underlie catastrophes that are the real context. In the case of Puerto Rico, we have a colony of the U.S., and that has a lot to do with the way that recovery has been shaped for the people in Puerto Rico and how systemic racism plays out within a colonial landscape. It also has to do with how austerity and unsustainable public debt, about how school shutdowns, about the lack of shelters, about how the lack of dignified housing for such a long time has to do what it has to do with the rights of people living in the island. It also has to do with the fact that we are an island in the middle of the Caribbean, and with climate change and with sea level rise. So when we're thinking about who we work with people who truly want to stay in a place that has been called home, even when nearly 12%, and sometimes it's said that 17% of our population has left in the last 10 years. And that has brought us a beautiful diaspora in the US, that has brought us a lot of things, but also a lot of grief. So we're working with families that have been broken on several occasions, not only by the catastrophes that occur because of hurricanes, for example, but also because of the constant neglect of disasters that become like unstoppable, and a continuity, of a crisis that has to do with the unsustainable life right now in the island. So we work a lot trying to accompany those people to finally be able to reach something that we call, and maybe we can talk about it later, just recovery. That was awesome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chriselle Pillay. And so I think one of the important things to kind of note and to just call out is that this really is, this is not a copy-paste situation, but at the end of it all, our communities are communities of survivorship, but communities that are continue to suffer because of, the things that they've been up against. So before talking about like the communities that we serve, I have to kind of orient us of who Houston is, and understand a short history of Houston. So Houston is, I'm not sure how many people know, the fourth largest city in the country. We're 2.3 million folks. We are recognized as the most ethnically and diverse city in the US and the largest medical center in the world. So that's what the internet tells you, right? But if you live there long enough, you listen long enough, and you open your eyes and you see what's going on, you'll also recognize or note that Houston also has the highest levels of inequality and segregation in the major cities aside from New York and LA. 1 in 5 households live below the poverty line. So these are the things that are happening, and I want to give a quick history, kind of how we came to be here. So we're a relatively young city. We are almost 200 years old, and we became known as the hub for oil and gas, and also the Port of Houston, which is where there's a lot of trade that comes in there. So during the migration after the Great Migration, after slavery was abolished, there were several towns that were founded, by freed enslaved people. And so, although slavery was abolished, Jim Crow laws continued to perpetuate and reinforce segregation and discriminatory acts. So then, Houston's continuing to grow, and so we have migration and we have growth, and there's a clash because at this point in the 50s and the 60s and 50s. That's when we see highway expansions. We see the port expansions. So that's when we start seeing highways coming through our cities, or not our cities, but through our communities, which starts to displace many communities, creating isolation amongst many communities, creating pollution in many of these communities. So then we move on to annexation and redlining. And I know everyone in this room understand what the redlining is. But in addition to that, we were also experiencing a lot of annexation. So many of these towns who had been independent became annexed by the city of Houston. So they were being taxed. However, they were not receiving the same public resources that all the other communities, the white communities, were receiving. And then with redlining, of course, that made it difficult for folks to get mortgages, to be able to purchase homes and make investments. Then white flight happened. That deepens segregation. And so now we're seeing what plays out as gentrification, immigration, displacement, and disinvestment. So that's creating, ongoing aging housing, affordable land for out-of-towners, which is driving up the cost in Houston. So these are communities that have faced layer after layer after layer, and then a disaster strikes. These are the communities that we serve. These are the communities that I've been working with over 10 years. And, we've seen disaster after disaster after disaster. And these are, communities that are have lower earnings. They tend to be communities of color. And what happens at this point in time is when the public narrative begins pointing the finger at people's personal choices. But personal choice cannot be used as an excuse to justify systemically racist policymaking. And that's what's continued to go on over and over again. So we have families that continue to wait for assistance, disaster after disaster. And so you have people saying, well, they don't have homeowners insurance. That has nothing to do with what's happened over this time. You don't know what's led up to this point where they couldn't afford homeowners insurance. But because they don't have it, then they can't make a claim. So therefore, their homes go unrepaired. Some folks do have some little money saved here and there where they can pay out of pocket, but they're outbid by other people who can pay contractors more. And if you just happen to be undocumented, then FEMA's no help to you because you're not going to be served at all. So I could go on and on about this, but I'll stop for a moment. But I will do a shameless plug really quickly. You can hear more about these stories on a podcast that I'm a co-producer and co-host of called But Next Time.
So good. So good.
Oh, I'm up. Okay. So I want to very, very much echo what Chriselle said, and that at the organization I work with at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we take everything with a racial justice lens. And so when we look at historical disinvestment that Chriselle talked about, that only doesn't just happen in Houston. Unfortunately, that happens in Black and brown neighborhoods all across the country. And so, disasters, when disasters do strike, especially floods and hurricanes, they tend to drastically hurt the lives of Black and brown folks more than they do other folks in the surrounding communities. And that's just because of, again, like Chriselle said, this is happening all across the country, but a historical lack of disinvestment. And one area that, in Houston, I can talk about that just highlights how disinvestment can lead to worse off conditions is the open ditch drainage system that happens in Houston right now, which is majority in African American and Hispanic neighborhoods, which cause when hurricanes do come, and even light rain sometimes, it could cause flooding and major flooding. And so, Chriselle said a lot, so I'll very much stop kind of short. But I will say that, when we think about historic disinvestment and historic disinvestment in Black communities, we have to also talk about just making sure that going forward, there is more investment in Black communities so that when disasters do strike, Black communities aren't suffering the most.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that kind of like scene setting. And Chriselle, I always feel like we tag you to like moderate the disaster panel. So I'm always like, man, like we got to get you on, just talk, just talking more. Like I said, ask questions all the time. I appreciate you. So now that we've kind of set that stage, I wanted to make sure that we have a baseline understanding. The name of the panel is Rights, Retreats, and Red Tape. And what are we talking about when we're talking about rights? So I was going to turn to Hannah. And Hannah, I was wondering if you could just give us a rundown of what a right to return is in the context of human rights and how such a human right applies to U.S. law. Does a right kind of in that human rights context apply here? When we say a right, what do we mean?
Noah asks big questions, so I will do my best. I might go in reverse. So, hi, everyone. I also want to plug, I don't know if you're going to do this, but Noah hosts a weekly call at 2 p.m. through the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. It is fantastic. It is an incredible amount of information and resources, and the folks on that call just have way more expertise than I will ever accrue in my lifetime. So I really, really recommend that phone call. All right, I'm done. Oh, shucks. So we've heard a lot about rights today, and so I'll just speak for myself. When I think about what is a right, I'm an attorney, and I have a background in human rights, and I think we're really talking about those rights that were recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was in 1948, after the atrocities of World War II, and we are most aware of a right when that right is violated. And so in the Declaration, we talked about the barbarous acts that shocked the conscience of mankind. These are things that happen to people. And when they do, we recognize that human dignity relies on that not being allowed to happen. And so it is not a reflection of something that is true in the world necessarily, but it is a vision of the way the world should be. And so as an advocate and a researcher, I look to those rights-based frameworks to help me think through the policies that need to change, the legal levers that are available to make that change. When we talk about the right to return, what we're talking about, again, in human rights world, this comes out of something called the Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. And this was a document that 192 countries in 1998 agreed to. It's not legally binding. It's sort of a rough agreement. We all think this is more or less the right thing. But the right to return is what it sounds like. The right to, once you are internally displaced within the boundaries of your own country, to return to the place that you're from. It's part of something called durable solutions. So there are sort of three options after you've been displaced. One is the right to return. The second is the right to reintegrate into where you've been displaced to. And the third is to resettle somewhere else. But the fundamental piece in all of that is that it is voluntary, it is your choice, and it is a product of self-determination, right? So all of those things have to stand. It's not just that you returned, but that you returned of your own volition and you are empowered to live a life of dignity after you return. So those are all really, really important. I did want to flag, I forget the rest of your questions, so I might just riff for a second.
Riff away.
Say what I want to say. So from a human rights-based approach, what I think is helpful is, I think rights can sound really floofy to people as this ideal, but yes, what about the lived experience of people? What about trauma? What about rights violations? And how does that inform our advocacy? What do we do with that? And so in a rights-based approach, I think about not just the rights holder and the rights that they have by virtue of their sheer humanity, but then what are the obligations that duty bearers, that's the wonky term I use, that the duty bearers have, what are the obligations they have to fulfill for that right to be enjoyed? So the right to vote is a really clear-cut example. If I have the right to vote, what does the state have to do? What does the local government have to do to ensure that that right's protected and fulfilled and upheld? And if it's violated, I have a way to vindicate that right. Right? There's a lot of structures that have to be in place for this to work. And so when we think about displacement, a lot of my research is looking at the rights of internally displaced peoples as we've envisioned them, as compared to what our federal system does or does not protect. And where we see protection gaps, what are the legal levers that we need to be pulling to make those gaps as small as possible? Just as a framing, because these people do incredible work, and I think what we've heard from all your experiences and what I've seen from the folks that I talk to is that there's three fundamental design flaws in the way that our disaster system works right now that perpetuates those inequities. One is that it is a fundamentally reactionary system. So we require harm to occur before we then try to reimburse that harm, and we're not making people whole. FEMA is very clear on this. We are not making people whole, and that's not their job. The second is that this is a system that protects property, not people. And that was very intentional when the Disaster Relief Act was signed, and then when it's been amended ever since. This was a system designed to restore the middle-class tax base of communities after a disaster hits. So if we're frustrated that people's essential dignity is not being recognized, that their non-monetary value is not being recognized, that's by design. And then the third piece is tied to this. There's a massive focus on cost effectiveness in our disaster system. And the result is that we enrich those who are already wealthy, and we take from or refuse to give to those who don't have sufficient wealth to qualify for those benefits. So a lot of my work is looking at the ways that we can start to change the way FEMA's interpreting its own mandate so it doesn't align with those design flaws anymore. And I'll leave it there.
Good vamp.
Thanks.
So kind of like looking at that context and that kind of like looking at, I guess I'll just say, like, how do we empower communities to not only like internalize that, but then provide the tools in order to circumvent that necessity for harm to occur before an assertion of rights. Ariadna, so you published honestly just a banger of an article in the NYU Law Review late last year called "Lawyering in Times of Peril." And in that article, you say that the socialization of legal knowledge and tools through training and framing actions around parties' needs, wants, and human rights rupture cycles of oppression. How does the lack of these tools impact the application of human rights, and kind of how do we address that? Because I think that y'all were kind of swimming in the same direction there.
Yeah, I also come from a human rights law background, and I love the word that you use, Hannah, fluffy. And when I talk to people about human rights, they often sound very poetic, and it's like those first days after the disaster, and everything is about generosity, charity, the heroic story of the people making the lines to get gas or get water, or the women in communities cooking for everybody, that romanticization of need, and also that ask for immediate response that is often framed on this idea of victimhood. And victimhood can be good to ignite sometimes a very quick response. But thinking about what happened with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in those first days, thinking about how victimhood has a very short time frame, and how the needs of disaster survivors can last not only months but years in the long run, because it nurtures inequality, and the way that people is being dispossessed not only by winds or floods, but dispossessed by a government that voluntarily neglects how to assist them. And I remember, in the case of Puerto Rico, one of the things that happened is that because of these calls based on charity, we got a lot of countries thinking about countries in Latin America, people from Europe donating to Puerto Rico water, essential supplies that were non-existent. Remember that Puerto Rico is an island, so there was no other way to bring it that it wasn't ships. And these supplies rotted in the ports because why? Because of the colonial relationship of Puerto Rico. We could not get these things out of the ships, even when people were starving, even when people were thirsty, because of the way that the laws frame the way that Puerto Rico has access to stuff. And I thought about the way that when FEMA and the Army came to Puerto Rico in those first days of the response, and the first thing that the government did, thinking back to the primary responsibility that human rights place on the state, the first action that the state took was a curfew. And the first official action that they took after that one was killing a black man using tasers that was trying to get medical assistance and had to violate the curfew. And I'm thinking about the way when oftentimes this happens, and we see, the pictures and the video of people in the roofs at times of flooding, or when we see people starving in the streets after a disaster, and we think the state has failed. The state has failed what? It has failed the primary duty to ensure the well-being of people, because that disasters are going to happen even if you don't really know when it's going to happen. But the state never fails. It's never non-existent. The state voluntarily decides what to put their intentions and effort into. And I'm thinking about those first days after Maria, when what we saw was a militarized response, where we saw people with rifles, when the DRCs were established, asking people what they were looking for, and we were like, what do you think they're looking for? And I'm thinking about the Army. When we went to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights a couple of months after Maria to denounce the atrocities that were happening on the ground in Puerto Rico, I remember the Army saying, we can't reach those difficult cases because of cost effectiveness. We can't reach those people, so they'll not have access to water if they're not able to reach the cities because they live in the mountains. And how nonprofits and how other organizations, about faith groups, they were able to reach those places and not to discard bodies or identities or whole communities because of their race, because of their income. And that's a response that was very crafted by the government, and that is never accidental. So when we talk about tools, we think that the first things on the ground, and we launched, Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico launched a response 24 hours after Maria. It had to do with providing people legal information, because we knew that in the context of Puerto Rico, And I'm like, I'm translating as I speak. But I remember like one of the first things that happened like a couple of months after the disaster was a summit sponsored by the governor to attract foreign investors to come in and buy properties. And I remember that one of the slogans was that Puerto Rico was power washed. And that led the way, so that laws that were already in place but were not that heavily promoted, laws that attracted investors to come to Puerto Rico, buy real estate, and have a full tax exemption. That's Law 60. You can Google it. It's horrible. Also, the fact that Trump at that same time like announced that Puerto Rico got a waiver and that now 98% of Puerto Rico was opportunity zone. That truly meant that at that moment we knew already that housing was going to be like the forefront of the fight. So when we think about human rights, which are often colonizing tools, very wide tools, very problematic tools, we thought about what do people need. So legal information, legal empowerment tools, eventually like developing a community paralegal program so that people in the communities could co-design and their own legal strategies around displacements. But thinking about how we could use like the legal framing that we had to address that besides FEMA, besides CDBG-DR funds, what we are fighting right now is the chance to stay in the island. And the tools that we have, with things as we lawyers are comrades in that table. Some people like bring social media skills, others bring communication skills, others are organizers. So we bring legal tools to that table and think about how can we change and transform the law, which is often a tool to dispossess people, into something that maybe people can use amidst a disaster to build something different, or at least to resist that push that traditional assistance often brings. And on that note.
Y'all are so great. I love y'all.
Ay, Dios mío.
Chrishell, I wanted to ask about something that you raised during our pre-panel discussion, which honestly was just the panel. I just was like, do you guys want to talk about disasters? And then they just started doing the panel. Talking about like the right to choose. What does that right to choose? And Hannah, I think, touched on that a little bit in her remarks in terms of a voluntary, making sure that a return is a voluntary return. What does the right mean? The right to choose mean for you in Houston, and what options are we kind of choosing from in reality on the ground, like following Hurricane Harvey or any other disaster that's kind of impacted that area?
So interestingly, the right to choose is actually one of 4 rights that was crafted collectively with several organizations and community leaders to really help try to shape and internalize, like you were saying, how do we internalize these rights? To help just, community folks just internalize what does fair housing even mean, and be able to communicate that in a way with elected officials, with developers, or whomever. And so just to go down quickly. So first there was the right to stay. And that was established as wanting people to understand that, you have a right to stay in the community of your choosing. You have a right, regardless of market pressures, regardless of increased property values. If that's a place that your community has roots and you want to stay there, you have that right. Then there also is the right to choose. If you choose to move to a community that better suits your family, you should be able to do that. If without being pushed out, without being having to deal with with NIMBY. Then also the right to equal treatment, meaning that you should have the right to live in the community and receive equitable resources. Just because the tax base is lower than another doesn't mean that you should not receive the same public services. And lastly was the right to have a say, that everyone should be able to have a right to say what's going on in their community. So right to choose was one of those, what we're talking about now, but I just want to make sure, kind of give the context of that. But when it comes to right to choose, especially following disaster, just period, honestly, low-income earners are not really given a choice from a full menu. They're relegated to specific areas. And that's pretty much it. And so, and what ends up happening is the folks that continue to be relegated to this, the Black and brown folks, that's internalized. So they don't even realize that there are other opportunities. They can aspire to do other things if they so choose to do that. And so we actually saw this play out just even on a larger field following Hurricane Ike. So after Hurricane Ike, I'm not going to go through the whole story, and David knows the story, in Texas, where there was some funds specifically to rebuild public housing. And so there was a development in Houston that the Housing Authority owned the property and was getting ready to move forward with construction, but had to have a public hearing with the community. Now, mind you, there was no city funds that were going to be used for this. Was all government. This was all funds, CDBG, the community, the DR funds, disaster funds that was going to go towards this, and I think low-income housing tax credits. To give even greater context, the development was going to be about 200 units, I believe, and of that, I think 20 were going to be affordable, and 5 set aside for public housing. I showed up to that hearing because this is what you do as an advocate. You go to the hearing. It was this is how traumatic it was. It was a rainy Wednesday night, so I just knew that no one would be there, and I walked into 200 white faces, just mad as all get out. And so I was, going to speak in support of this development, and just to hear all that folks had to say. They're going to steal the tires off of our cars. How are our seniors supposed to stay safe? What about our kids? They're going to overcrowd our kids. With 20 affordable units and 5 set aside for public housing. So that's just 25 units, maybe. Oh, and not to mention there are already other apartments in the area. So that was going to just be a small choice, right? So folks who wanted to move to that community didn't even have that choice, because what happened, the city did not even support it. Mind you, there was no money that went into this from the city. But the city decided to not even support it, and so the whole deal was dead. Some litigation happened, shortly thereafter. Things started kind of moving in Houston because of that. But all that to say that choice has not been realized, and that's something that all people should be able to have when it comes to what best serves their community, or what best serves their households.
No, for sure. I mean, it's like, NLHC's motto, right? It's like in everyone has the right to an accessible, affordable home in communities of their choice. Is like choice being the essential element to a lot of this work, underpinning that. Moving to David, I know the NAACP LDF released an excellent study on housing discrimination in Memphis titled "The Bad Housing Blues," which, as someone that loves snappy titles for things, I very much appreciate. And that study found that, with significant barriers to securing safe and affordable housing for housing choice voucher holders in that city as well as Shelby County. Is there how does housing choice voucher and other types of discrimination play into our right to choose?
Yeah, no, I mean that it severely limits your right to choose. So we did this analysis in conjunction with the National Fair Housing Alliance, so I have to shout them out as well. And so for folks who don't know, Memphis is a majority black city in Tennessee, and is very close to both Mississippi and Arkansas. And it has historic segregation because of redlining, like we talked about before. There's been historic disinvestment in their communities, and there's also just very, very much, there's just a very, very segregated city. And so when we sent housing testers to do testing work in Memphis to see if there was discrimination going on for people who had housing choice vouchers, 7 out of 10 housing testers were discriminated against when they tried to get housing in a high opportunity area. So these are areas where you want to go, more white, have a little bit better schools, more parks, more sidewalks, better access to groceries. 7 out of 10 housing testers were discriminated against when they tried to get housing. And which is also pretty crazy, though, as well as the studies found, is that 4 out of 10 housing testers were discriminated against in majority black neighborhoods that are gentrifying. So yes, I mean, it is pretty crazy, right? So not only can you not go as a black person in Memphis to, if you want a new apartment, you can't go to a high opportunity area, but you also can't stay in your own neighborhood, right? Because it's being gentrified now, and you're still facing discrimination. So when we talk about, when you have this, do you really have a choice? when you say, where do you go next? If there is a disaster that ever hits, Memphis, it is, where are the black folks going to go? If they can't go to high opportunity areas, they're going to be discriminated against. If they can't stay in their same neighborhoods, where are they going to go? And so, really, the study, I hope, highlights that for, African Americans in Memphis and in Shelby County, there has to be a change in the level of how housing choice vouchers are administered, because if there was any type of disaster that ever happens, and we've seen this happen in Houston, saw this happen in New Orleans when folks tried to come and they just tore down the public housing in New Orleans and even tried to let those folks back in. And so, I think it really limits when we talk about right to return and having those choices. It is really hard for black folks in this country because their choices are just so severely limited, and especially all folks who just have housing choice vouchers, they're just very, very severely limited based on your income, and if you really do have a right to actually return.
Yeah, no, and it's a good point for that's in blue sky time. That's when it's not raining.
That's when it's not raining.
And then when you add in rain to that,
when you add in not doing replacement, 1-for-1 replacement on public housing and things like that. So, your choices are just severely, severely limited. And it's just really, really unfortunate. And I think that's why we definitely need changes at the federal level to try to deal with not only housing choice vouchers, but also disaster recovery as a whole.
Speaking my language there. So now we kind of have a basis in human rights law and its application, as well as the inequity and violence that impacts the communities that we work with. So we've arrived at the present, that is to say, the present where there are disasters occurring amid worsening climate change that increase their impacts, be it directly via ocean temperature increase, sea level rise, or indirectly as climate-influenced pandemics and resource scarcity and a reduction in community resilience wholesale. Because all disasters are local, as they say, we return back to kind of the communities where we work. And as we discussed first, is there displacement occurring here today? And what is the consequence of that displacement? Are human rights being protected? And what are the consequences of those human rights not being protected? And Ariana, we can start with you and just go down the line.
Yeah, in our case, we have lost nearly 62 miles of coastal lands in the last 10 years, and that has been recently put out by a study commissioned by the University of Puerto Rico. It also showcases how, the impacts of climate change in the island, not only regarding sea level rise, but also the vulnerability to major hurricanes like what just happened with Hurricane Maria, or even with hurricanes that may be a category 1 hurricane like Fiona, what can have devastating consequences on the landscape of the island. So we have been trying to get both FEMA and HUD to address the issue of climate change in Puerto Rico, acknowledging that although relocation needs to be the last alternative for families who do not want to relocate and cannot be the first option, it cannot be the first mitigation option. We need to address the fact that we are going to have communities that will have no other option than to relocate. Why? Because they're living already in the sea, or they're living already in spaces that are just so risky that there's no way they can live there. We have tried to get the local government to understand and using human rights standards like free, prior, informed consent, and that's something that has been used with First Nations across the world to address a relocation or a displacement minimization policy. What we're seeing right now is a resistance from the government to acknowledge relocation and to acknowledge the fact of, for example, managed retreat, or the fact that we're going to be needing to move whole communities as a systemic issue. And instead, what we're still seeing is that we have FEMA assistance and CDBGDR assistance that are essentially individual applications, and maximizing chances of, for example, checkerboarding and the vulnerabilities of communities that now will not be able like to demand open schools because they were already like diminished or devastated by these assistance policies. We have been able through Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico to change things that have been trying like to place like more far the possibilities of just recoveries. Like for example, thinking about the intersection of people like often living in places of risk and the lack of formal title. To give you a number, half of the people in Puerto Rico lack a formal title, and that has several reasons. Some of them are economic, some of them are political, social, but nothing in the law in Puerto Rico required people like to have a formal title. What happened was that when FEMA came in, and that's something that they also did in other Black or brown communities throughout the U.S., they started requiring people proof of ownership using a higher standard than the standard that the people in Puerto Rico use. There's something very colonial about, having the empire addressing how people get to be an owner of their own land, but that's something that we can have over coffee. And then there was an OIG report that talked about how the OMB had no matter, like talking about how Puerto Rico's ownership looks like. But what we saw, what it was a complicit action between not only the federal government, the Trump's administration, the Fiscal Control Board, which is like another animal that Puerto Rico has, but also the way that the state was implementing that same ownership requirements that had no root on the law to ask people to be able to prove ownership, or if not, you were going to be denied assistance. What I'm trying to say is that when we were able to win FEMA and to address the fact that FEMA was denying people assistance based on ownership, and it was a wrong decision that was not based on the law, we saw that our local government, even when we won, started applying the same policy for CDBG-DR funds, thinking about how can we deny assistance to these people and banish them from a recovery process, and at the same time state that these lands were too risky to have house being repaired or rebuilt, but at the same time they could offer those same lands to hotel or to Airbnbs or to other developers and investors. So our process trying to make and addressing CDBG-DR individual issues, application per application, participant per participant, has been trying to paint the broader picture about how these policies in the end are responding to displacement by design. And how we have, for example, an individual assistance program that is called the R3 program, Repair, Relocate, Rebuild program, that has been literally almost non-existent or not effective. And at the same time, you have these policies that are offering exactly the same lands to investors that, with little or no regulations. And how CDBG-DR has been a vehicle to stop people from receiving assistance and transforming people from being owners regarding of their, of the legal documents that they have, to being tenants of a state that acknowledge no rights whatsoever to tenants ever. And how CDBG-DR has become a vehicle to spearhead low-income housing tax credit developments that, as you all know, and as we have been discussing here, provide little to no guarantees to people on the ground. And what does that mean to an island that in some places has already lost 28% to 57% of the available units for rental to Airbnbs with no regulations? And on that note, yeah. I need a drum roll, something at the end, because this is.
I see, and this
need
is
something.
When you tune into the calls. This is just what I do. I'm just just go off. Y'all are smarter than me, anyways.
But I'm
I'm
Puerto
just in
Rican,
here
I
being
need
like,
the
oh,
sounds.
really?
I need the sounds because I never know what's happening. Too sorry.
I'm like, man, somebody should do something about this. Oh, good. Chriselle, now it's your turn to go off. Go off.
No. Okay. So as I'm listening to Ariadna, I'm thinking, wow, so you listen to geography, place, and politics, they're different, but it still leads to detrimental impact regardless, right, of the place, regardless of the geography, regardless of the politics. And so so I'm of course speaking through the context of Houston. Sure, we have displacement. But we also have disinvestment that is rooted in distrust. So let me explain that a little bit. So we have disasters that happen. I mean, we had, like the big one was a Harvey, of course, right? But we also have all these like micro disasters that happen oftentimes. And, you know, people often talk about, oh my gosh, these people are going to be so displaced. But it's some people that can't even afford to be displaced. They're living in homes that are moldy, that where you can look up and see the skies. They don't trust anybody. They don't trust government. They don't have the means. And so they just make do. I look at actually my next door neighbors. I actually live in a community that has the open ditches. And my next door neighbor does not have electricity. From time to time, they have a generator. They have a boarded up windows, but because he's disabled, the brother who's disabled is not on the deed, and his sister lives in another state, and so he can't apply for any assistance because the owner does not live there, and he's afraid to even ask for any assistance, and so he just makes do. So there are a lot of people in community that live like that. So sure, we have displacement, but we also have great disinvestment, but a lot of it is, you know, rooted in distrust. But even when we talk about displacement, some of the things that really cause displacement in Houston, we're seeing a lot of affordability periods that are coming to end in many of the developments that are subsidized. And so, you know, they're selling them off. And we're looking at, so where these people are going to go? Because many of them don't have transportation to move out to the suburbs. So, you know, that's a huge problem. Also, even, it's funny because it's like all these things are going on and oftentimes layered. So even in my neighborhood, because we're close to downtown, but it's a historically Black community, but continues to be disinvested, the property values are going out the roof. And so, like, I've seen our property value increase probably like over the past, I would say 4 years, probably increased like 30 to 50%. So my neighbors can't afford that. Many of them, you know, don't know about tax exemptions, so they don't take advantage of it. And then also, disaster is being used as a tool for displacement. We have right now a public housing, one of the public housing development that has basically been shut down. Now, mind you, there's some other, you know, the freeways I was talking about earlier. So there's a freeway expansion coming, right? And it's, you know, that development is in the way. So then Harvey happens. It was perfect, the perfect storm. Like, oh my gosh, Harvey just destroyed this. It did not destroy it. However, that's what they're claiming. Because when you talk to tenants there, they're like, yeah, so my unit's still livable, but it's been sold off. And so now the tenants have vouchers. And this development was built in the 50s. So this is a place where there have been many generations. People have roots there. And so, but get this. Right across the street, there's a 150-acre development that's going on, a live-work-play center. And there's a 9-part golf course over there, like literally across the street. But none of them can take their vouchers and find a place in that community. So this is what's playing out, like live, like right now. Like I went over to the golf course last week just to see what's going on. So yeah, displacement is in full play.
No, and it's so crazy because it's all like, I don't know. I was just struck by like they make do, and it's like how like, you know, I think it's getting less common, but you know, people used to be like, man, they're so resilient. Like, and it's like, man, that's such a resilient community because he's like living without electricity. And I was like, yeah, man, well, that's like a human rights violation. Right. So, like, you know, that's not like
to get banged on over and over and over and over and over and over again.
So it's just like, you know, yeah. I just wanted to kind of call that out. David?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about not only displacement, we also have to talk about climate resiliency and how our public housing just doesn't have it right now. And so, you know, there's thousands of units right now, public housing and low-income tax credit units that are in floodplains, that are in direct areas where floods can happen. If a hurricane or something happens, they're in direct contact with that. And I think there's also thousands of units that are right now close to toxic waste dump sites, EPA toxic sites. There are thousands of public housing units that are close to those sites. There's one of my big things that I think as the world warms up, we have to think there's no requirement for public housing to have air conditioning, right? Especially in the South and with temperatures getting, that is one thing that I think we just haven't thought about all that much is how do we get our public housing, our LIHTC housing, our low-income housing to be climate mitigated. And so, right now we continue, especially, I also come from Texas, so I also have a lot of examples in Texas. But, right now there's currently in Texas, what the department that controls LIHTC funding, what they're trying to do, low-income housing tax credit funding, sorry for using the acronym, they're trying to get rid of all of the environmental factors to build LIHTC housing in Texas. So that if you get these funds, you don't have to do any type of right now. There's no NEPA review, and what they're trying to do is get rid of all of the environmental hazards requirement for LIHTC funding in the state of Texas. So I mean, those are things that are at the antithesis of what climate mitigation is supposed to be doing. We're actually going backwards a little bit and saying that no, it doesn't matter. So right now, in Galveston, Texas, there's an apartment complex that they use LIHTC funding. It is still in a floodplain. It is, very, very close to environmental hazards, environmental waste dumps, and they just gave them $7 million to refurbish it and rehab it. And so it's we are using our money and our money to, invest in places where we, should not be investing our dollars because they're not climate mitigated. And so what we have and what you're going to, and hopefully not, cross our fingers, knock on wood, but if there's another storm that hits Galveston like Hurricane Ike did, will these folks be in harm's way? Because they're still in a floodplain. The $7 million is not raising, their building. It is just going into, repainting stuff and getting more security. So, those are the things that I think we need to also be talking about is how do we get climate mitigation for already the public housing that we have, already for the LIHTC housing that we have, and then how do we put requirements on local governments, state governments, and our federal government to make sure that when we go forward, we know climate change is real. When we build more public housing, we build more LIHTC housing, how do we make sure that it's in places that, one, are climate mitigated and you're building it knowing that climate change is a real thing?
David, man, this is excellent, because that's why I put red tape up there, right? Because it's always a question. It's like, what's the difference between red tape and like protecting rights, or like sanely building within the coming climate reality? It's like, to different people, those are different things.
Yep.
And I think sometimes, like, rightfully so, there's like dumb administrative rules that don't need to exist. But then oftentimes I feel like the fight against those rules, oftentimes, like, there's collateral damage there where like NEPA reviews like is necessary. Yep. Like if you're building in a floodplain, like, or like things like that. So I think that's just such a thank you for bringing that up.
One other thing I just want to mention is evacuation routes. Is having public housing close and LIHTC housing close to the evacuation routes, because we know again that most of these public housing places are in places where they're going to be more prone to disasters happening. So how do we make sure that they have evacuation routes and things like that? Those right now are just, they're non-existent in how folks are thinking about doing public housing and new public housing. And so we need to start thinking about that type of stuff. Low-income housing tax credits. Those are like tax credits that developers get to build affordable housing.
Indeed. And like, y'all should check out, there's this dope report from Texas Housers about Sandpiper Cove in Corpus Christi, and about a failed evacuation ahead of a potential hurricane for that HUD-funded housing project, and it just like went sideways all the way. So like, I always kind of point folks to that to look at in terms of like, additional public housing / climate change / disaster recovery related points for that. So that's dope. Hannah, you've been super patient.
I'm enjoying this.
And I know. Good. So, I keep hearing the term about this climate retreat, or like great displacement, being breathlessly talked about in like New York Times op-ed pages. And sometimes I see that phrase as dangerous because it's like, who's doing the retreating? Where are we retreating from? Where are we retreating to? And kind of that idea that certain communities are lost causes all the way, and like it's like, well, we shouldn't build there. Not to just, David was just talking about it, but not necessarily in that context, but like of just like, well, what's the point of even doing anything there if they're going to be under 4 feet of floodwater anyways? So I wanted to see, Hannah, if you could give me a rundown of the term climate retreat and how that idea has been promulgated, maybe internationally, and kind of how the human rights kind of framework has been thinking about climate retreats, and is there a framework for a human rights-centric climate retreat?
Keep asking big questions.
That's why I brought you.
Yeah.
That's why I put you on the pan.
All right. I'm going to tweak the question. I think this is another space where we get into floofy human rights law, and I think especially with retreat, retreat, managed retreat, assisted relocation, planned relocation, these are all euphemisms for the same thing. The idea that we will preemptively and intentionally move an entire community from a high-risk area to a low-risk area. And there are other types of adaptation responses that are more individualized. You might hear about buyouts. That tends to be a state or federal funded program to purchase someone's individual property and they move somewhere else. There's a lot of challenges with buyout programs that we can get into. But retreat is really about this community-wide effort. And there are lots of thoughts about how to do that well at the international level. I personally find them too distant to be useful. I think what is useful is we have a lot of examples of this in the United States already, and there's a lot of people doing really good work to think through best practices. So I might just name a few of those resources in the hopes that they can be useful to you all. As you can guess, retreat, and I personally like assisted relocation. I think retreat is very triggering for folks as a signal of failure, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about people making possibly the hardest choice they can and undertaking one of the most difficult things to do, which is pick up your entire life with all the people around you and pick somewhere else to live and move your family there. And I can't contemplate what that takes, right? That's just unbelievably hard. And then the law makes it really, really hard too. So the Georgetown Climate Center has a managed retreat toolkit. If you just Google managed retreat toolkit, you'll find it. And it just gives a good layout of the different state and local agencies that tend to be involved in those kind of processes. As David was alluding to, you've got floodplain management, you've got natural resource management, you've got housing, you probably have the Army Corps. There's just a lot of people that need to be in the room. But I think the legal piece is almost secondary to the community engagement piece and how you go about that community engagement. And there are a lot of people who've done buyouts badly. And so there's a couple other folks I would point you all to. One is the Climigration Network, and full disclosure, I'm on their leadership board, so like make of that what you will. But this is a group of practitioners and frontline community leaders that are forced to engage in the buyout and retreat conversation because their communities will not exist in 10 years. So these are Alaska Native villages in Alaska that live on permafrost that is thawing. So if you can imagine living on Jell-O, that's kind of what it's like. Just telephone poles are tilting over. The primary water infrastructure is leaning this way. So these are communities that are uninhabitable, but these are also communities that live where they live because the Bureau of Indian Affairs put them there. And so there is a deep and earned history of distrust with both the federal and state governments. And so the conversations that need to happen need to be done in a deeply respectful and intentional way. And I think the hard part is it means that the people who are leading those conversations can't be in control unless they are the community. And that's something that a lot of people are uncomfortable with. But we have to say that, like, look, if you are coming in because you know the result that this community needs to get to, then you can't be in that room. So the Climate Migration Network, I think, is one of the groups that's doing a good job of just setting out a list of general principles and how you can have those conversations. And those principles are being co-designed by the very communities that are engaging in this work. The last effort I'll mention is a joint effort. This was through the Climate Migration Network, but also with the Natural Resources Defense Council, some FEMA staff, and a couple other folks. And this is a report that's going to come out soon. And this was an effort to just think through like what has worked and not worked in retreat and buyout programs. And they did 2 different sessions, one with people who actually participated, who were the recipients of the buyouts, and then the buyout program managers. And so what is the state and local infrastructure that needs to be in place to do this well? Because like we've seen, if you try to do something after a storm hits, it's not going to work. That's when you have disaster capitalism. And the reason for that is that the people who should be there to stand up for their rights are too busy being in crisis. So all of this needs to happen when we've got blue skies. And I think the good news is, I just wanted to flag this as good news. We've talked a lot about federal reform. Disaster is a little different because the feds step in when the states ask them to. And so a lot of advocacy, and often the most effective advocacy, happens with your state emergency offices or whomever is delegated to be responsible in disasters. And I recognize that not all states are open to having that conversation, and the person in that office might not be open for that conversation. But if they're an elected official, then they need to be reelected. And so I just wanted to flag that the point of advocacy is probably a lot more local than you think it is. And I've had a lot of conversations with emergency managers, again, in Alaska, who just didn't know they didn't know. So when we talk about why assistance doesn't serve the subsistence needs of Alaska Natives, they just didn't know. And after disaster, those communities weren't in a position to advocate for themselves. And so now we're having the conversations pre-disaster to say, okay, next time, here's the aid you should request. Here's the way you design your application. Here are the translation services that need to be in place, right? That all has to happen when you've got blue skies. I lost my train of thought. But the punchline is Georgetown Climate Center Managed Retreat Toolkit, Climate Migration Network, and I can share out that buyout report from FEMA and NRDC when it comes out.
Nice. And I'll also say, like, if you're interested in getting involved locally, you want to learn more about anything that we've been talking about today, like, just drop me an email. I will literally pick a time and then talk to you about this for 2 hours straight. So, like, literally best part of the job. So, please do reach out, and we'll, like, hook you into, like, whatever's going on. If nothing's going on, get you some resources to, like, get something going on. So, just wanted to kind of reiterate that. All right, so we're at the point, we got like 13 minutes left. So this is a small enough group. Like, what are we feeling in terms of Q&A? I have some additional questions that are excellent. I wrote them. And so we could do that. Or, like, since this is a small enough group, you can kind of just, like, corner us somewhere after the panel and, like, pepper us with questions that way. Any idea? Any thoughts? So, no. Oh, okay. All right. Well, we'll finish some questions then. Cool. This is a preview of what goes on at our weekly DHRC calls here. So, Ariana, I've heard you reference Puerto Rico's HUD-funded R3 program, which is a reconstruction, repair, and relocation program. That it should just be called the relocation program. Is this an example of an opportunistic application of a climate retreat and recognizing that language is triggering, but I'm using that there as to justify the negative kind of a negative application of a premature decision of climate retreat?
Yeah, so when, as I was saying before, when CDBGDR, which are like the long-term recovery funds, came into Puerto Rico, the local government repeated a lot of the barriers that were already in place so that people could not have equitable access to the funding. And as I said, this is something that was like crafted with the idea of trying to channel people to programs that had to do with social interest housing or low-cost housing, and nothing that had to do with repairing or rebuilding houses that were deemed to be too risky. Think about Puerto Rico having 240,000 people living in flood zones, at least. So it's nearly 1/4 of the population 1/4 of the housing units, I must say, that are like in flood zones. The government never prepared, like, paved the way so that that could actually happen. There has never been an inventory of housing. There is no like inventory or regulation regarding landlords. So people don't even know where available units may exist. We have a waiting list of nearly 15,000 people like waiting just for public housing, and the long list for vouchers is almost the same. So what happens was when this program came in, it was like a promise to provide dignified housing finally, to have some kind of capital to make that possible. And what happened was that the government of Puerto Rico created the first blanket statement saying that no house in flood zone could be either repaired or rebuilt. And that was a big issue because, again, being an island, the land is limited. So thinking about mitigation strategies was out of the table. They eventually, through advocacy and through litigation and everything that was done, we were able to change that. But what happened was that the program shifted unofficially to a relocation program. And nearly at this time, we are like months before the 6th anniversary of Hurricane Maria, only 2,600 vouchers for relocations have been like given to people. Out of those vouchers, only 180 families have been able to actually get a home, obtain a house. And that has had to do with the fact that Puerto Rico is lacking not actual inventory of houses, but we're lacking affordable housing. These vouchers may go up to $200,000, and still in Puerto Rico at that price, it's almost impossible to get a house at this moment. And there are like number of reasons, one of them being the fact that we don't have a source of income anti-discrimination law. It also has to do with the fact that, that landlords are just like refusing to be, or owners are refusing like to obtain any kind of federal funding so that they don't appear on any federal list. So there are like several barriers to that, but it's the fact that relocation is not working. And it has to do also with the fact that people, as Michelle was saying, they simply don't trust the government. The government has had for several years like emptied out public housing units, saying we're going to revamp this and you're going to return to these places, only to never go back. So I think that we have like multiple things there, and climate change is not a consideration for anyone at the table. And still, we have, besides that CDBG-DR funding, a huge allocation of CDBG MIT, or mitigation funding, that is going to give us the chance to, for the first time, have money to try to move whole communities using this kind of federal program, this kind of federal funding. At this moment, we're trying to gather best practices so that we can move the government to have actual conversations with communities, but also thinking, and maybe that's something that we can talk later about, what will happen with the people that will never want to move? What are we going to do with them? What is the human rights approach with the people who simply don't want to move, even if they have to move? And as human rights lawyers, human rights advocates, I think that's going to be like the great challenge, because we can like be part of a system that's dispossessing them and trying to say what's the correct like route to use. So I'm finishing up with a question for the panel.
Panel?
I can give an example. I think the answer is we can't, right? Like the human rights response is self-determination, and end of sentence. Easier said than done, right? I think then the remaining question is what about, like, who maintains that community? I will say the conversation changes when the community that can no longer live there has a lot of money. So, for example, Ile de Jean Charles, Louisiana. Many of you know this story, but there was a really fantastic panel in Miami at the Aspen Institute, and Colette Pichon-Battle, who many of you know, former executive director of the Gulf Coast Center on Law and Policy, now Taproot Earth, really fantastic work, talked about how, this community, as a non-federally recognized tribe, the money for that relocation went through the state of Louisiana. The tribe had a vision for what that relocation would look like. And then that vision got changed by the state of Louisiana. They were moved after being told that the infrastructure, the roads, the housing where they lived could not be maintained. The state would not maintain it. And then private sport fishermen came in and rebuilt the road and rebuilt the infrastructure and are using that land for profit. So again, it comes back down to cost effectiveness and what we choose to value. And I think really interrogating rather than just assuming that that's the way it has to be has legs in a way that it never did before, because we have an administration that has said over and over and over again, and their executive mandates requiring that federal agencies integrate equity into everything that they do. There are federal mandates that they direct 40% of all climate money to disadvantaged communities, which tend to be the communities that we care the most about. There is a federal mandate to ensure that climate resiliency funds are spent in an equitable way. And I think HUD is going to do a rulemaking later this year integrating the federal flood risk management standard. Is that right? Maybe.
Man, I hope so.
I spend a lot of time on the unified agenda. So all I'm saying is I think arguments that would not have worked before, if they're ever going to work, they're going to work now with the administration that we have, and particularly the leadership at FEMA. It's going to take a long time for that to trickle down because the folks on the ground have been doing things a certain way for a long time. But I think we can really start to push back on the cost effectiveness piece, which then I think changes the way we talk about relocation and who deserves to stay where. I'll leave it.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, just I guess double downing on that. I'm just thinking about how, to your point, when it impacts folks who have the money, then the attention will be paid. Because I'm thinking about, of course, in Houston, there's a community, a white, wealthier community, and after one of the major flood events, and this community is right on the bayou, and it flooded. And so the Army Corps of Engineers provided grants to the homeowners, at least, and I feel like I'm lowballing this, but at least $100,000 to elevate their homes. And so now when you drive through that community, you'll still see these stately, homes, but now they're elevated 10 to 15 feet off of the ground. However, after Harvey, some folks that live in more modest communities, those communities were deemed dangerous. And there was, the city of Houston had some funds for buyout. City of Houston said, no, this is too tough to do. I'm not doing it. Here, Harris County, take my money. So Harris County said, okay, we'll figure out how to do it. So they came up with the formula. And the buyout is not even enough for people to really move to anywhere that's comparable to where they currently live. So right now there's like a fierce, campaign, I guess, if you will, of challenging that. And our colleagues, Texas Appleseed, are working a lot on the buyout programs in Harris County. But I think a lot of times what it still comes down to is that, it continues to create, vast inequity. And this isn't like totally connected, but it is connected. So something I want to stress, and I don't know if folks have heard this before, but I always like to share this stat. So, and talk about like just the wealth inequality that's created because of disaster. So Rice University and University of Pittsburgh conducted a study, and they found that after a natural disaster, whites gain an average of $126,000 of wealth following recovery, while people of color saw their wealth drop $10,000 to $29,000. So the data doesn't lie. And I mean, if we had time, I'd tell you a story about two different paths of recovery, all starting at the same place. But it's real. But I'll stop. I know we probably only have like 2 minutes left.
Oh, no, you're good. I appreciate you. David, did you want to go off on this question? I like had that whole like blight removal comparison, and I was like feeling real fancy about it, and I was like, cause I was right, I was like, man,
I think,
man, I'm on to something here.
Yeah.
But now I'm like, well, it's like, it's different because it's like you couldn't just be like, oh, this neighborhood is undergoing urban renewal, and like I'm just gonna stay anyways. Yeah. Like, so it's like not effective.
It's not the same, but I also think, like Chriselle said, it's also about the choices that local folks want to make. And like in Gulfport, Mississippi, for example, there's, 2 apartment complexes very close to each other. One was a LIHTC development, low income tax credit development. One was like, regular market rent housing, and the market rent housing and their developers figured out a way, both financially, to get their apartment complex raised and to have it raised, and so that folks in those apartment complexes did not have to leave. Whereas the low income tax credit, apartment complex, they did it, and they didn't get the funds from the state of Mississippi to do the same thing. Right, they're right across the street from each other. So all those residents then had to leave. So I think it's all about the choices that local, state, and federal governments are making. But because sometimes there is a choice to stay. There is a choice to stay right where you are, and it's just about getting the resources to stay right where you are.
No, thanks so much. And I think we're at time. We pretty much just stuck the landing, so I'm very impressed with all of us. So thank you so much, everybody. All right, see you at dinner.